The movie kicks off in 2023, a world on the brink of collapse. Mutants are being hunted relentlessly, not just them, but also the humans who once stood by their side. The fearsome Sentinels, towering robotic enforcers, descend from the sky in massive pods, targeting the last of the X-Men who are in hiding in Moscow. Just as all seems lost, the story shifts thousands of miles away to China. A jet lands amidst the rugged mountains, and stepping off are some of the most legendary mutants: Professor Charles Xavier, Storm, Wolverine, and Magneto. They reunite with Kitty Pryde, Bishop, and the other surviving mutants, and something remarkable is revealed. Those who perished in Moscow are alive once more. This miracle, as it turns out, is thanks to Kitty's extraordinary time-linked abilities, which allowed Bishop to foresee the deadly assault and act in advance. Professor Xavier lays out the stakes. Kitty's power to send a consciousness back through time might be the only way to halt the Sentinel threat. But not just a few days, decades into the past, would be required to prevent the creation of these adaptive killing machines from ever coming into existence. The origins of the Sentinel program are traced back to Dr. Bolivar Trask. Obsessed with controlling mutant powers, Trask began experimenting on them, leveraging their abilities to enhance his own scientific pursuits. One mutant, Raven, discovers Trask's dark agenda and confronts him, ending his life, but she is captured in the process. By analyzing her DNA, Trask's successors unlock the secret to her shapeshifting powers, paving the way for the creation of Sentinels capable of countering any mutant ability. And thus the devastation begins, but it all stems from 1973. The team debates the hazards of time travel. The journey is deadly for anyone without extraordinary healing, and tampering with the past could have unpredictable consequences. Some people might never be born, and events could unravel in unexpected ways. Despite the risks, it's their best shot at saving the future. Wolverine finds himself waking in 1973, in a room brimming with retro charm. Stepping outside, New York City feels alien, a version of the city far removed from what he knew. Meanwhile, in Washington, Dr. Trask presents the Sentinel Initiative to Congress. Politicians dismiss the threat, arguing mutants are too few to warrant concern. Trask warns them that mutants could one day dominate humanity, but his proposal is rejected, leaving him frustrated yet undeterred. In Saigon, Colonel Sanders inspects mutant soldiers alongside Major William Stryker. Among them are Havoc, Toad, and another unidentified mutant, all slated for transfer to Trask Industries. In a twist, Sanders is revealed to be Mystique, her true form hidden beneath a human guise. Wolverine heads to the Xavier mansion in search of Professor Xavier, only to find it seemingly abandoned. Hank McCoy confronts him, urging him to leave, and a brutal fight erupts. Hank shifts into his blue beastly form, clashing fiercely with Wolverine, but eventually, Wolverine meets Charles, who confirms Wolverine has traveled from the future to prevent the Sentinel uprising. They discuss how Raven's powers were exploited to create the Sentinels and realize Magneto's cooperation is essential. He will never abandon someone in need. Wolverine senses something is off. Hank explains that Charles relies on a special serum. While it allows him to walk, it suppresses his telepathy. The weight of past losses, including students lost to the Vietnam War and the shuttering of his school, drove Charles into despair. The serum became his refuge from suffering. Initially resistant, Charles slowly begins to listen to Wolverine, understanding the urgency. They recognize that Magneto, imprisoned deep beneath the Pentagon for allegedly assassinating President Kennedy, is their next key to changing history. Meanwhile, Mystique, disguised as Dr. Trask, infiltrates his office at Trask Industries. She combs through confidential documents, uncovering intricate Sentinel schematics and chilling autopsy reports detailing the mutants exploited for Trask's experiments. As Mystique scans the grim reports in Trask's office, she is confronted with images of fallen mutants, faces she knows all too well, like Azazel and Angel Salvador. A silent tear slides down her cheek as the weight of their losses hits her. Just then, Trask's secretary steps into the room. Instantly, Mystique morphs back into Trask's form, accepting the documents without a hint of suspicion. Her cover remains flawless. Meanwhile, Wolverine, Charles, and Hank set out to recruit Peter Maximoff, better known as Quicksilver. Wolverine pitches the mission, and Peter initially teases them, making light of the danger. But the moment Wolverine mentions a break-in at the Pentagon, the young mutant's curiosity and thrill for action takes over. Together, they infiltrate the heavily guarded Pentagon and manage to free Magneto from his secure cell. Quicksilver's superspeed turns a nearly impossible escape into something almost effortless, zipping past guards and clearing the path. Once the job is done, Peter gracefully bows out, leaving the team to continue their mission. Tension flares the instant Magneto is free. the old wounds between him and Charles resurface with full force. Wolverine attempts to explain that he comes from the future, but history's scars run deep. Charles lashes out, accusing Magneto of abandoning their fellow mutants, while Magneto counters, blaming Charles for surrendering hope for their kind. The exchange underscores their fragile relationship. They need one another, yet trust has been severely fractured. The scene shifts to Paris, alive with energy in a buzzing nightclub. Mystique, disguised as someone else, scans the room and spots a Vietnamese general mingling with officers and Russian soldiers, all laughing and drinking, oblivious to the danger in their midst. The general, confident and careless, invites her to his private quarters. The moment the door closes, Mystique reveals her true form. In a fluid, precise motion, she pins him to the floor, her foot pressed to his throat until he passes out. As she searches the room, Mystique's eyes land on a piece of paper, an official invitation to an upcoming political summit in Paris. Without hesitation, she seizes it, setting her next move in motion. High above the world on a private jet, Charles and Magneto pass the time with a game of chess. Their friendly rivalry is more than a pastime. The board mirrors their conflicting philosophies. During their conversation, Magneto claims he never killed President Kennedy, insisting instead that he tried to stop the assassination. He even speculates that Kennedy might have been a mutant himself. The revelation complicates their fragile alliance further, sowing seeds of doubt even as they prepare to work together. The day of the international summit arrives, and the stakes are higher than ever. Charles, Magneto, Hank, and Wolverine move through the building, tracking Mystique before she can strike. At the same time, Dr. Bolivar Trask arrives alongside William Stryker, carrying sensitive Sentinel blueprints and a powerful device capable of detecting anyone with the X gene. Chaos erupts when Mystique is spotted, turning the carefully controlled operation into a public spectacle. Wolverine catches sight of a younger Stryker, triggering searing memories of the suffering he will endure in the future. The shock destabilizes his connection to the timeline, momentarily shaking his focus. The public display of mutant powers sends shockwaves through the U.S. government. Inside the White House, Trask and Stryker brief President Nixon and senior officials. Trask seizes the opportunity, warning that Mystique's abilities make her a threat unlike any other. She could impersonate a Secret Service agent, or even the president, and with that access, potentially launch a nuclear strike. His argument is fierce and uncompromising. Mutants are too dangerous to ignore, and capturing Mystique may be the key to stopping them. Nixon grants the funding, greenlighting the Sentinel program. Soon, Trask's scientists collect a sample of Mystique's blood from the streets, convinced her DNA holds the secret to building adaptable Sentinels capable of countering any mutant ability. Back at the mansion, Charles starts losing the use of his legs again, but this time, his telepathy returns. Hank retrieves the serum that can restore Charles' mobility, but at the cost of suppressing his psychic powers. Charles refuses the injection, knowing that his gift is far too vital in the battle to come. Charles steps back into Cerebro, but the moment he connects, the full weight of the world crashes into him. Pain, panic, grief, and thousands of frightened voices rush through his mind all at once. It is too much. For a brief moment, Charles breaks down, convinced he is not strong enough and that the future made a mistake by sending Wolverine instead of someone else. Wolverine reminds him that, originally, Charles was supposed to be the one to travel back, but his mind could never survive the strain inside Wolverine's body. Logan was chosen for one reason only. His healing factor made him the only person capable of enduring the journey. Then, through Wolverine's consciousness, Charles reaches something extraordinary. He makes contact with his future self. The older Xavier speaks to him with calm wisdom, reminding the younger Charles that people can lose their path without being lost forever. He tells him that pain does not have to be the end of someone's story. And above all, he reminds him that hope is their most powerful gift. Those words cut through Charles's fear and give him the courage to stand up again, not physically, but emotionally. Meanwhile, Magneto makes his own move. He sneaks into Trask Industries and discovers the plans for the Sentinels. Seeing an opportunity, he decides not to destroy the machines, but to claim them. As the Sentinels are being transported by train, Magneto tears metal from the tracks and forces it into the machine's internal structure. By lacing them with metal, he makes sure that when the time comes, they will answer to him and no one else. In the dark future, Bobby comes up with a desperate idea. Kitty is growing weaker as she struggles to maintain the time connection with Wolverine. If she collapses, the mission ends. Bobby suggests finding Rogue, who is being held captive in a guarded facility. Since Rogue can absorb another mutant's power, she may be able to take over Kitty's role and keep Wolverine anchored in the past. Magneto agrees and they head for the facility, hoping they are not too late. Back in 1973, Charles finds the strength to use Cerebro again. This time, he manages to locate Mystique at an airport. Unable to speak to her directly, he reaches her through the people around her, using bystanders as his voice. He begs her to stop before she crosses a line that will shape the future in blood, but Mystique refuses to listen. She believes killing Trask is the only way to protect mutant kind. Through another person's eyes, Charles notices her ticket and realizes she is heading to Washington. The day of the Sentinel presentation finally arrives. President Nixon is ready to unveil the machines to the world, presenting them as humanity's answer to the mutant threat. Wolverine, Charles, and Hank arrive as well, racing against time to find Mystique before she assassinates Trask. As Nixon delivers his speech, Magneto makes a terrifying entrance. Using his power on a massive scale, he lifts RFK Stadium from its foundation and carries it across the city, dropping it around the White House like a gigantic metal fortress. The entire event turns into chaos. People scream, security panics, and the nation watches in horror. Charles searches through the confusion and finds Mystique disguised as one of the Secret Service agents. She is close to Trask, armed and ready to pull the trigger. Charles reaches into her mind, trying to stop her before the future repeats itself. At the same time, Magneto activates the altered Sentinels and turns them against the humans who built them. He uses the moment as a warning to the entire world, showing humanity what mutants can do when pushed too far. But in doing so, he only confirms every fear that men like Trask have been spreading. His display becomes the perfect argument against mutants. In the middle of the destruction, Hank fights desperately against the Sentinels while Wolverine goes after Magneto. Logan tries to stop him, but Magneto is too powerful. He rips metal rods into Wolverine's body and hurls him into the water, pinning him beneath the surface. Logan sinks helplessly, trapped below as the battle above continues to spiral. Mystique, still wearing her disguise, gets close enough to act. Instead of killing Trask, she turns her weapon on Magneto and shoots him, saving Nixon and the others from his attack. Charles then speaks to her one last time, asking her not to let anger decide her future. He tells her that destiny is not already written, and that she still has the power to choose who she becomes. And in that moment, Mystique lowers the gun. She chooses not to kill Trask. That single decision changes everything. Instead of being remembered as the mutant who murdered a government scientist and confirmed humanity's worst fears, she becomes the mutant who saved the president. The world sees a different story. The fear surrounding mutants begins to shift, and support for the Sentinel program collapses before it can become the nightmare of the future. Magneto escapes, and Mystique disappears as well. Charles allows them both to go, not because he approves of their choices, but because he still believes they can find their way back someday. Then Wolverine wakes up at the Xavier Institute, but this is not the ruined future he left behind. The world has changed. The halls are alive again, filled with students and familiar faces. People he watched die are now alive. Iceman, Rogue, Kitty, Colossus, and Storm are all there, living normal lives and helping teach the next generation. Even an older Hank McCoy greets him with warmth, but the biggest shock comes when Wolverine sees Jean Grey. She is alive, standing there as if the tragedy he remembers never happened. Cyclops is with her too. The painful future Logan carried in his mind has been erased. Charles welcomes him back, gently telling him that they have a great deal to catch up on. Charles asks what he remembers from the old timeline. Wolverine says the last thing he remembers is drowning. He recalls being pulled from the water by Stryker and his soldiers. But in the final reveal, Stryker's eyes flash yellow, showing the truth. It was not really Stryker at all. It was Mystique who found Wolverine and saved him. There are some superhero movies that just continue a franchise, and then there are movies that walk in with a toolbox, a broom, a first aid kit, and maybe a time machine, because the whole series needs fixing. X-Men. Days of Future Past is very much that second kind of movie. This isn't just another chapter where mutants show up, powers fly around, buildings collapse, and we wait for the next sequel tease. I mean, yes, all of that is here too. But this movie has a much heavier job than a normal blockbuster. It has to connect two different generations of X-Men films. It has to bring back the older cast without making them feel like nostalgia bait. It has to continue the first-class storyline. It has to deal with the mess left behind by some of the weaker entries. And somehow, while doing all that, it still has to work as an actual movie. That's the part I find impressive. Because on paper, this could have been a disaster. You have the original cast, the younger cast, time travel, Sentinels, Mystique, Wolverine, two versions of Professor X, two versions of Magneto, and years of franchise baggage sitting in the background. One wrong move and the whole thing could have felt like a crowded Comic-Con panel with a plot attached. But Days of Future Past understands something very important. This story matters because the franchise itself is at a breaking point. The future in the movie is broken, yes. Mutants are being hunted. The world has gone dark. But in a weird way, the X-Men film series also feels like it is trying to escape its own damaged timeline. The movie is not just asking, can these characters change the future? It is also quietly asking, can this franchise still save itself? And that gives the film an extra layer of energy. It feels like a rescue mission on two levels. Wolverine is trying to save mutants from extinction, while the movie is trying to save the X-Men series from becoming trapped by its own past mistakes. That could have felt cheap. It could have felt like the filmmakers were just pressing a reset button and hoping we wouldn't notice. But somehow, it feels exciting. Maybe because the film doesn't run away from the weight of everything that came before. It uses that weight. It takes the old cast, the new cast, the mistakes, the emotional history, and the fan expectations, and throws them all into one story about regret, fear, survival, and second chances. That's why Days of Future Past matters. It's not just big, it's not just stylish. It's not just another superhero sequel trying to look important. It's the rare franchise movie that feels like it knows exactly how much is riding on it. And even better, it actually rises to the challenge. Before getting into Days of Future Past, you kind of have to look at where the X-Men movies were at this point, because this franchise had already been through a lot. The first X-Men was a good start. Not perfect, not massive in the way superhero films would later become, but it had something. It had a strong cast, a serious tone, and enough confidence to make these characters feel like they belonged on screen. At the same time, you could still feel the movie searching for its full identity. It was almost like the franchise was standing at the door, not quite inside yet. Then X-2O happened, and that's where the series really clicked. X-2O took the foundation of the first film and made everything sharper. Bigger action, darker atmosphere, better emotional stakes, and a much stronger sense of what the X-Men world could be. For a lot of fans, that was the point where the franchise stopped feeling like a promising experiment and started feeling like something special. But after that, yeah, things got messy. X-Men. The Last Stand is one of those films where I can understand why some people defend certain parts of it. It has moments. The scale is bigger, some of the visuals work, and a few of the performances still carry weight. There are action beats that on their own are not bad at all. The problem is that the movie is trying to carry too much at once. Too many characters, too many storylines, too many major emotional turns that don't get enough breathing room. Instead of feeling epic, it often feels rushed and crowded. Characters who should feel important are either underdeveloped, pushed aside, or written in ways that don't quite line up with what made them interesting before. It's not completely worthless, but it is a clear step down from where the series had been. Then came X-Men Origins, Wolverine, and honestly, that didn't help the situation. Again, you can find pieces in it that had potential. Hugh Jackman still had the role locked in. There were ideas that could have worked with a cleaner script, but the movie had a lot of the same problems as The Last Stand. Too much noise, not enough control, and characters who felt more like pieces being thrown at the screen than people being properly explored. The Wolverine was better, definitely better. It brought things down a little, gave Logan a more focused story, and showed that the character could still carry a film when the material had some shape to it. But even then, it wasn't flawless. It improved the mood around the franchise, but it didn't completely erase the damage. And then First Class came along, which was honestly the refresh the series needed. By going back to younger versions of Charles and Eric, the movie found a new angle. It didn't feel like it was just dragging the old series forward out of obligation. It had energy, style, and a cast that made the familiar characters feel alive again. James McAvoy and Michael Fassbender gave the franchise something it badly needed, a reason to care about where the story could go next. So by the time Days of Future Past arrives, the X-Men series is in this strange position. It has history but also baggage. It has beloved characters but also damaged continuity. It has one of the strongest superhero sequels in X-2O, but also some entries that left fans frustrated. And that is what makes Days of Future Past so interesting. It doesn't come into a clean franchise. It comes into a franchise with scars. Some good memories, some bad decisions, some brilliant casting, some wasted potential. So the movie isn't just continuing the X-Men story. It's walking into the middle of a complicated family argument and somehow trying to make everyone sit at the same table again. So going into Days of Future Past, expectations were complicated to say the least. On one hand, Bryan Singer was back in the director's chair, and for anyone who loved X-2O, that was huge news. You know, the guy has a knack for balancing big action with character-driven drama. That alone made people sit up and pay attention. Then there's the cast. Oh boy, the cast. The movie promised a mashup of the old guard, Patrick Stewart, Ian McKellen, Hugh Jackman, and the younger generation from First Class like James McAvoy, Michael Fassbender, Jennifer Lawrence. And yeah, fans were understandably nervous. Mixing two generations of characters can be messy. You risk underusing some, overshadowing others, or just creating this weird crowd scene where nobody has a real moment. And don't forget the Sentinels, giant, unstoppable mutant-killing robots. That alone made some people giddy with anticipation. Finally, a villain with actual stakes. This wasn't just some random antagonist in a leather coat. These things were terrifying, adaptive, and a legitimate threat. The comic book angle added another layer. One of the most famous storylines in X-Men history was being adapted. People who had been reading the comics for decades were bracing themselves. Would it honor the source material, or butcher it for the screen? So yeah, excitement was high, but so was caution. Some viewers were pumped, expecting a franchise-defining spectacle. Others were wary, thinking, okay, can they really pull this off without it turning into a cluttered mess? And then there were people like me, not die-hard comic experts, but longtime fans of the movies, who were hoping for just one thing. A film that respected the history of the series while giving us something thrilling to watch. Not a simple continuation, not just another superhero blockbuster, but something that could actually feel important, honestly. Walking into the theater, that was the vibe. Equal parts anticipation, curiosity, and a touch of please don't screw this up. The basic setup of Days of Future Past is actually pretty simple, even though the movie around it is carrying a lot of franchise baggage. In the future, everything has gone wrong. Mutants are being hunted down by Sentinels, these advanced robotic weapons built to track them, adapt to them, and wipe them out. And it's not just mutants either. Humans who helped mutants, protected them, or stood beside them are also caught in the destruction. So right away, the movie gives you a future that feels less like a warning and more like the aftermath of a war nobody really won. The surviving X-Men are barely holding on. Professor X and Magneto, who have spent so much of this series on opposite sides, are now working together because the situation has become that desperate. Old grudges don't mean much when extinction is knocking at the door. Their plan is risky, but at this point, risk is all they have left. Kitty Pryde uses her ability to send Wolverine's consciousness back into his younger body in 1973. Not his whole body, not a clean little time machine trip, but his mind thrown back into the past while his future body stays behind. Wolverine is chosen because he can physically survive the damage of the process. Basically, if anyone can handle having his brain dragged across decades, it's Logan. His mission sounds straightforward. Find the younger Charles Xavier, free the younger Magneto, and stop Mystique from killing Bolivar Trask. But of course, nothing about that is actually easy. Trask is the man behind the Sentinel program, and Mystique's assassination attempt becomes the key event that pushes history toward disaster. Her DNA is later used to make the Sentinels even more dangerous, giving them the ability to adapt against mutant powers. So one violent act in the past becomes the beginning of a nightmare future. That's the hook. Wolverine has to walk into 1973 and convince people who don't know him, don't trust each other, and in some cases can barely hold themselves together, that the future depends on them making a different choice. And that's where the movie becomes more interesting than just go back in time and stop the bad thing. Because the mission is not only about changing an event, it's about changing people before they become trapped by anger, fear, and regret. Alright, let's talk about the future in Days of Future Past. And by future, I mean apocalyptic, everything is on fire, the world is finished future. The movie opens with a timeline where things have gone horribly wrong. Mutants have been hunted to near extinction, humans who help them aren't safe either, and the world feels cold, grim, and hopeless. You can feel immediately that this isn't just a setup for a fight scene, it's a real, high-stakes disaster. And that's where the Sentinels come in. These things aren't your average CGI goons. They're gigantic, adaptive, and terrifying. They learn from every encounter, anticipate mutant powers, and basically make survival feel impossible. Watching them tear through mutants in the opening battle, brutal. It's a reminder that the stakes here are life and death, not just superhero showboating. What's cool is that the Sentinels aren't just big robots with guns. They represent something bigger, fear turned into technology, prejudice weaponized, the idea that the world's hatred can manifest as a literal machine capable of wiping out those who are different. The threat feels real because it's relentless and methodical. Every scene in the future timeline reminds you that if Wolverine doesn't succeed, everything is lost. It's also visually stunning. The ruined cityscapes, the barren streets, the destroyed buildings, it all screams dystopia without needing exposition. You don't have to be told that humanity and mutants are on the brink. You can see it. And that makes the stakes in the past timeline hit even harder. So yeah, the future is grim, but it works perfectly as motivation for Wolverine, Xavier, Magneto, and everyone else. It's urgent, it's terrifying. And it's one of the reasons the movie grabs you from the first frame and doesn't let go. The time travel idea in Days of Future Past is not exactly new. Let's be honest about that. The whole go back into the past to stop a terrible future from happening setup has been around for a long time. The moment the movie explains its plan, you can almost feel the shadow of other sci-fi stories hanging over it. A ruined future, one desperate mission, one person sent back to change the event that started everything. It is familiar territory. But familiar does not automatically mean weak. What matters is how the movie uses that idea, and Days of Future Past uses it surprisingly well. It doesn't overcomplicate the basic hook. The future is destroyed. The Sentinels are winning. Mystique's actions in 1973 are the trigger point. Wolverine has to go back and stop that chain reaction before it becomes impossible to undo. Simple enough. And honestly, that simplicity helps the film. Because there is already so much happening. Two casts, two timelines, old relationships, broken friendships, political tension, mutant extinction, franchise history. The time travel concept needed to be clear. If the movie had buried itself in rules and technical explanations, it could have become exhausting very quickly. Instead, it gives us just enough. Kitty can send Wolverine's consciousness back. His body stays in the future. If things go wrong in either timeline, the mission collapses. That's all we really need to understand. The movie doesn't ask us to spend the whole runtime drawing diagrams in our head. It wants us focused on the characters, not trapped in time travel homework. Now, does the logic hold up perfectly if you start pulling at every thread? Not really. There are questions, there are convenience points. There are moments where the movie clearly cares more about emotional payoff than strict causality. And depending on how picky you are with time travel stories, that might bother you a little or a lot. But for me, the film gets away with it because the premise is clean and the emotional stakes are strong. The time travel is not just there as a gimmick, it gives the characters a second chance. It lets the franchise look backward and forward at the same time. It turns past mistakes, both inside the story and honestly within the series itself, into something the movie can actually confront. So yes, the concept is familiar. You've seen versions of this before. But Days of Future Past takes that old sci-fi skeleton and gives it enough energy, tension, and character weight that it still feels alive. The structure of Days of Future Past could have been a complete headache. I mean, just look at what this movie is trying to juggle. You have a ruined future, a 1970s mission, the original X-Men cast, the first-class cast, Wolverine's consciousness stuck between timelines, Mystique's assassination plot, Trask and the Sentinel program, Charles Xavier at his lowest point, Magneto doing Magneto things, and a whole bunch of mutants appearing in different corners of the story. That is not a small plate, and for the first few minutes, I can understand someone feeling a little lost. The movie throws you into this dark future where characters are already fighting, already hiding, already using powers in ways that are not fully explained. If you haven't watched the earlier films recently, or if you only half, remember who everyone is, it can take a moment to settle in. But once the central mission becomes clear, the movie finds its rhythm. The smart thing is that the film doesn't try to give equal weight to absolutely everyone. It knows the story has two timelines, but it also knows where the emotional focus needs to be. The future timeline gives us urgency. It shows us what happens if the mission fails. The past timeline gives us the actual drama, broken Charles, dangerous Eric, conflicted Mystique, and Wolverine trying to keep the whole thing from falling apart. That balance helps a lot. Instead of constantly jumping around just for the sake of it, the movie uses the future like pressure. Every time we return there, we're reminded that time is running out. The Sentinels are closing in. The survivors are barely holding on. Meanwhile, in the past, every mistake feels heavier because we already know where it leads. Still, this is definitely not the easiest X-Men film to walk into cold. There are names, faces, powers, histories, and relationships that the movie expects you to understand at least a little. It doesn't stop every 5 minutes to explain everything, and honestly, I respect that. But it also means casual viewers might feel like they walked into a family argument halfway through dinner. Everyone knows why they're mad except you, and yet somehow, the film mostly keeps things readable. The plot is dense but not impossible. The timelines are complicated but not completely tangled. The movie gives you a clear emotional line to follow. Stop Mystique, save the future, and bring Charles back from the edge. As long as you hold on to that, the rest of the moving parts become easier to ride with. Are there moments where the structure gets a little messy? Sure, a few, especially when you start thinking too hard about continuity and cause and effect. But as a viewing experience, the film moves with enough confidence that you don't spend the whole time fighting the timeline, and that's probably the biggest compliment I can give it. For a movie built out of two eras, two casts, and several layers of franchise history, Days of Future Past rarely feels like homework. It feels busy, yes, sometimes very busy. But it also feels controlled, and that control is what keeps the complexity from swallowing the movie whole. One of the funniest things about Days of Future Past is that, beneath all the Sentinels and time travel and mutant drama, this movie is basically doing franchise cleanup. And not quietly either. By this point, the X-Men timeline had become, let's call it complicated. That's the polite word. You had the original trilogy, then the Wolverine spin-offs, then First Class, which felt like a prequel but also didn't line up perfectly with everything we already knew. Then there was The Last Stand, a movie that made some very big choices and left the series with a lot of damage to carry. So Days of Future Past comes in and says, okay, what if we just use time travel to deal with all of this? And honestly, that could have felt lazy. It could have felt like the studio pressing a giant reset button because the timeline had become too messy to manage. In some ways, yes, that is kind of what happens. The movie is absolutely trying to repair the franchise. It is trying to smooth over old problems, reconnect the old cast with the new cast, and give the series a cleaner path forward. But the reason it works is that the repair job is built into the story. The characters are trying to change a terrible future, and at the same time, the film itself is trying to change the future of the franchise. That parallel gives the whole thing a weirdly satisfying energy. It doesn't feel like a random retcon slapped onto the end. It feels like the movie is making the franchise's own broken history part of the drama, and that's pretty clever. Because instead of pretending the previous films didn't happen, Days of Future Past uses them. It brings back the emotional weight of the original cast. It continues the younger cast from First Class. It acknowledges that things have gone wrong, both in the world of the movie and, honestly, in the series itself. Then it tries to bend the timeline into something more hopeful. Does it fix everything perfectly? No, not even close. There are still continuity questions. Some details do not line up cleanly. Some things are ignored. Some new problems are created while old ones are being solved. If you start mapping the whole timeline on a wall with red string, you will probably lose your mind before the second cup of coffee. But in the moment, the emotional effect is strong enough that most of those issues don't completely break the movie. It feels less like a reboot and more like a correction. A soft reset, but with actual character stakes behind it. The film is not just erasing events because they were inconvenient. It is asking whether the worst possible outcome can still be avoided if people make different choices. That's why the retconning goes down easier than it probably should. By the end, Days of Future Past manages to make franchise maintenance feel dramatic. That sounds ridiculous, but it's true. It takes messy continuity, old mistakes, fan frustration, and years of uneven storytelling, and turns all of it into part of the film's identity. It's not seamless. It's not completely logical, but it is surprisingly satisfying. And for a series that badly needed a way out of its own timeline, that's a pretty big win. Now, for the comic book fans out there, Days of Future Past is interesting because it's not a straight adaptation. Sure, the movie borrows its name and the broad time travel idea from one of the most famous X-Men storylines. You know the one, the future is a nightmare. Someone has to go back and fix it, arc that's been a fan favorite for decades. But don't expect panel-for-panel accuracy here. The filmmakers took the essence of that story and used it as a framework to fix the movie universe. A lot of details are changed, some characters are emphasized differently, and the timeline gets tweaked to connect the older cast with the younger cast. Wolverine is front and center, which makes sense for the screen but isn't exactly what the comic focused on. Mystique has a much bigger role, the Sentinels look different, and the story mixes a lot of historical flavor with the classic sci-fi premise. But here's the thing, it works. The movie isn't trying to be a page-for-page comic adaptation. It's using the comic as a springboard to tell a cinematic story that satisfies longtime fans while also being accessible to casual viewers. It gives you the thrill of seeing your favorite arcs come to life, but it also plays with the material in clever ways, bending history, merging timelines, and giving characters moments they didn't have on the page. You could argue it takes liberties, and it does, but instead of feeling disrespectful to the source material, it feels like it's honoring the spirit of it. The moral stakes, the mutant versus human tension, the idea that one choice can change everything, those core ideas are intact. Everything else, well, the filmmakers molded it for the screen, and the result is surprisingly satisfying. In short, comic fans get the nods, the Easter eggs, and the core drama they love, without the movie getting bogged down in trying to be a literal adaptation. It's clever, it's ambitious, and it actually feels like it knows what makes the X-Men comics special in the first place. Bryan Singer's return is a big part of why Days of Future Past feels as controlled as it does. Because honestly, this movie could have gone off the rails very easily. You have two timelines, two generations of actors, a dystopian future, a 1970s political thriller angle, Wolverine jumping through time, Mystique carrying the fate of the world, Magneto doing whatever Magneto wants, and a whole pile of franchise baggage sitting in the corner. That is a lot of material. In the wrong hands, it could have turned into a loud, overstuffed mess. But Singer brings a kind of discipline back to the series. He doesn't make the film feel small exactly. The scale is huge. The stakes are huge. The action can be massive when it wants to be, but there's still a sense that someone is keeping the story on a leash. The movie has spectacle, but it rarely feels like spectacle is driving the bus. The character drama is still in charge. That's the thing Singer understands about X-Men when he's at his best. These films are not interesting only because mutants can throw metal, open portals, read minds, or heal from anything. The powers are fun, sure. That's part of the appeal, but the real weight comes from the people underneath all that. Their fear, their anger, their loneliness, their need to belong somewhere. And Days of Future Past keeps returning to that. The future scenes are dark and brutal, but they don't just exist for action. The 1970s scenes have political tension, but they don't become dry exposition. Charles' pain matters. Eric's distrust matters. Mystique's anger matters. Even Wolverine, who could easily dominate the whole film, is used more like a bridge than a blunt instrument. Singer also knows when to slow down. That's important. A lot of superhero movies are terrified of silence. They keep rushing, joking, exploding, cutting, moving, anything to avoid letting a scene breathe. But here, some of the strongest moments are the quieter ones. The conversation between the two Xaviers, for example, is not flashy, but it gives the movie emotional gravity. And then when the action comes, it lands harder because the film hasn't been screaming at you the whole time. The pacing is sharp too. For a movie this packed, it moves cleanly. There's not much dead weight. It has room for humor, room for tension, room for big comic book imagery, but it doesn't feel like every character is fighting for their own separate movie. That's probably the biggest compliment to Singer's direction here. He makes a complicated crossover feel surprisingly focused. Not perfect, no. Some logic still bends. Some characters are still underserved. The timeline stuff can still make your head hurt if you stare at it too long, but as a piece of direction, this is a confident return. Singer takes a franchise that had become messy and gives it shape again. He brings back the darker tone, the emotional seriousness, and that sense that the X-Men world is about more than costumes and powers. It feels like he knows the material. More importantly, it feels like he knows why it matters. The screenplay for Days of Future Past deserves more credit than it probably gets, because this is the kind of story that could collapse from its own weight. Just think about the ingredients for a second. A destroyed future. A mission in 1973. Wolverine acting as the link between timelines. Young Charles Xavier at rock bottom. Magneto locked away, then released into a mission where nobody fully trusts him. Mystique becoming the key to everything. Trask building the Sentinel program. The older cast waiting in the future. The younger cast carrying most of the drama. And somehow, all of this has to feel like one movie. That is not easy writing. What's impressive is that the script usually knows where to put its attention. It doesn't try to make every character equally important, because that would be impossible. Instead, it gives the story a clear spine. Stop Mystique, save the future, and bring Charles back to himself before history hardens into tragedy. That simple emotional line keeps the movie readable. The dialogue also does more than just explain the plot. There is exposition, obviously. A movie like this needs it, but the better scenes are built around character tension. Charles and Eric don't just talk about the mission, they reveal how differently they see the world. Wolverine doesn't just deliver warnings from the future. He has to push people who are angry, broken, or stubborn into believing something they can't prove. Mystique doesn't need long speeches to show where she is emotionally. Her choices tell us enough. That's where the narrative balance works best. The film has humor, but it doesn't overdo it. It has suspense, but it doesn't become joyless. It has big action, but the action usually comes out of character conflict rather than feeling pasted on. Even the franchise repair work is folded into the story instead of stopping the movie dead for continuity housekeeping. Still, the script is not bulletproof. Some decisions feel a little too convenient. There are moments where characters behave in ways that seem designed mainly to extend the conflict. The time travel logic gets shaky if you start examining it too closely. And by the final stretch, you can feel the movie asking you to accept emotion over clean cause and effect. But honestly, for a film carrying this much baggage, the writing holds together better than expected. It gives the audience enough clarity to follow the mission, enough character drama to care about the outcome, and enough momentum to keep the whole thing from feeling like a lecture on X-Men continuity. That's the real achievement of the screenplay. It takes a story that could have been messy, crowded, and exhausting, and turns it into something surprisingly smooth, not flawless, not perfectly logical, but sharp enough, focused enough, and emotionally strong enough to make the chaos feel controlled. The tone of Days of Future Past is one of the reasons it stands apart from a lot of superhero movies. This is not a bright, jokey, everyone is having fun kind of comic book film. It opens in a future where mutants are basically being wiped off the map. The world is ruined, the heroes are desperate, and the whole story has this heavy feeling hanging over it from the start. You don't get the sense that these characters are just waiting for the next cool fight scene. You get the sense that they are exhausted. And I like that because X-Men has always worked best when there is sadness underneath the spectacle. These characters are not just people with powers. They are people who have been feared, rejected, hunted, used, and misunderstood. So when the movie leans into a darker, more serious atmosphere, it feels appropriate. It fits the material. But what keeps the film from becoming too miserable is that it still knows how to breathe. There is humor here, just not the loud, constant kind. The movie doesn't stop every few minutes to throw in a punchline. It lets the serious moments stay serious. When Charles is broken, the film doesn't immediately undercut it with a joke. When the future timeline shows the Sentinels tearing through mutants, it doesn't wink at the audience. It lets the danger feel ugly. Then when humor does arrive, it actually lands. Quicksilver is the obvious example. His scenes bring this strange little spark into the movie. Suddenly the film loosens its shoulders a bit. The prison escape sequence is playful without feeling out of place, and that is harder to pull off than it looks. It gives the audience a release, but it doesn't destroy the tension of the larger story. The 1970s setting helps too. The costumes, the period details, the little touches of style, they add some cheekiness to the movie without turning it into a parody. There's a bit of fun in the texture of that world, even while the story itself is dealing with fear, violence, and political paranoia. That balance is important. If the movie were all darkness, it might become draining. If it were too light, the future threat would lose its power. Days of Future Past finds a middle ground. Serious, yes. Intense, definitely. Sometimes brutal, but not empty, not cold, and not humorless. It understands that a superhero movie can have weight without becoming boring. And honestly, that is part of why the emotional moments work. The film gives pain room to exist, but it also gives us just enough wit and energy to keep the story alive. One of the things I really appreciated about Days of Future Past is how it grounds its story in a political and historical backdrop without ever feeling like a history lesson. Most superhero movies don't bother with that. They're happy creating their own universe and ignoring the real world. But here, the filmmakers leaned into 1973 in a way that actually adds texture to the story. Nixon-era politics, the tail end of the Vietnam War, even small period details like costumes, decor, and cultural references, it all makes the world feel lived in. It works on two levels. First, it gives the past timeline a sense of authenticity. The tension in that era, distrust, paranoia, political maneuvering, mirrors the fear and xenophobia the mutants are facing. You can't just paint mutants as the victims in a vacuum. The world they exist in is complicated, and the movie shows that. Second, it gives stakes to the time travel element. The events that Wolverine has to prevent aren't happening in a blank space. They're occurring in a real historical context, which makes the consequences feel heavier. Mystique's actions don't just endanger mutants. They intersect with the governments, the military, and even historical events, which amplifies the urgency. The film even plays with real-life figures in a fun, ironic way. It's subtle, nothing too distracting, but it's enough to make you realize the past isn't just a backdrop. It's an active part of the story, and it's a clever way of making the world feel bigger without adding endless exposition. You're aware of what's going on politically and socially, and it shapes the choices the characters make, often in ways that feel organic rather than shoehorned in. So yeah, the historical and political grounding adds depth. It gives the past timeline weight and context, and it's another reason the movie feels more ambitious and intelligent than your standard superhero flick. One of the things that always sets the X-Men movies apart, and Days of Future Past really leans into it, is how the story reflects real-world issues through the lens of mutants. At its core, this is a movie about fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of difference, fear of what people don't understand. That fear manifests in xenophobia, oppression, and ultimately, the hunt for mutants. The Sentinels aren't just robots. They're a symbol of society trying to control or erase what it fears. And the humans who help mutants, they get caught in that same wave of hate. Survival becomes the central concern. The mutants aren't just fighting to save the world, they're fighting to save themselves and each other. Every decision, every fight, every morally gray choice is colored by the fact that they could all be wiped out in a moment. It's tense, it's dark, and it gives the action real stakes. But what's clever is that the movie doesn't just show fear and oppression as external forces, it's internal too. Charles struggles with despair, Eric with anger and resentment, Mystique with her identity and how the world sees her. Their choices are influenced by trauma and prejudice, just as much as the Sentinels or governments around them. That layering makes the story feel more meaningful than a standard heroes versus villains setup. You're not just watching explosions and powers, you're watching a group of outsiders navigating a world that hates them, trying to find a way to survive while making moral choices in a nearly impossible situation. And in a way, it's a subtle nod to real life. People who are different, marginalized, or misunderstood often have to fight for survival too, whether socially, politically, or personally. The film uses mutants as a lens, but the emotions are universal. So while there's plenty of action, Days of Future Past earns its weight through these themes. Fear, xenophobia, oppression, survival, all threaded through the story so that the battles feel meaningful and the stakes feel real. One thing that really surprised me about Days of Future Past is how much it trusts its drama instead of just throwing endless action at the screen. I mean, sure, the action is there, giant sentinels, mutant powers going haywire, Wolverine fighting in two timelines at once, Quicksilver bending reality in slow motion. It's all visually spectacular, but what makes it actually work is that the action always comes out of the story, not the other way around. The battles aren't just about seeing who can punch the hardest or blast the most energy. They're about the characters, their fears, their grudges, and the consequences of their choices. When Charles and Eric argue or when Mystique makes a life-or-death decision, the movie lets those moments breathe, and then the action flows naturally from it. You feel the stakes in every explosion because it's tied to the people on screen. Even Wolverine, who could have easily carried the movie with just his fighting, is mostly a plot driver. His battles are exciting, yes, but they're framed by tension, desperation, and emotion. That makes you care. If the movie had just been one set piece after another without giving us the human side, it would have been exhausting. Instead, it's thrilling because you're invested in why it matters. And honestly, that's a rare thing in modern superhero films. So many blockbusters forget to let the characters lead and just try to impress with spectacle. Days of Future Past manages to balance both. The action is big, but the drama never takes a back seat. That's what makes the movie feel grounded, even when the timelines are messy and the robots are huge. Every fight, every chase, every slow-motion sequence matters because it's tied to someone's hope, fear, or moral choice. And that's the kind of balance that keeps you glued to the screen for 2+ hours without feeling like your brain is on autopilot. The real emotional center of Days of Future Past is not the time travel. It is not even Wolverine, even though he is the one carrying the mission on his back. The heart of the movie is really Charles, Eric, and Mystique. That triangle is where the film gets its weight. These are not just three characters standing around the plot. Their choices are the plot. The future becomes a nightmare because of what happens between them, what they believe, what they fear, and what they are willing to do when the world keeps pushing them into corners. Charles especially is in a rough place here. This is not the calm Professor X we usually picture. He is not sitting in a chair with wisdom in his voice and hope in his eyes. He is broken, angry, tired. He has stepped away from his power, from his purpose, from the dream that was supposed to define him. And James McAvoy plays that pain in a way that feels raw without becoming overdone. You can see the future Professor X somewhere inside him, but buried under grief and failure. Then you have Eric, who is almost the opposite problem. Magneto has not lost belief. If anything, he believes too strongly. He believes fear must be answered with force. He believes humans will always turn against mutants. He believes survival means taking control before someone else does. Fassbender gives him that dangerous calm, that quiet certainty, like a man who has already decided history will prove him right. And between them is Mystique. Raven is the one whose decision can change everything. She is hurt, angry, and tired of being hunted. Her revenge feels personal, but the consequences become global. That is what makes her role interesting. She is not just a villain to be stopped. She is someone standing at the edge of becoming a symbol other people will use, twist, and weaponize. So the movie is not simply asking, can they stop Mystique? It is asking, can Charles still reach her? Can Eric resist turning every problem into a show of power? Can Raven choose something other than revenge before history locks her into that choice forever? That is where the drama comes from. the best scenes are not always the loud ones. Sometimes it is just Charles looking like he has given up on the world, or Eric making the exact ruthless decision you hoped he would not make, or Mystique hesitating for half a second, and that half second carrying the future inside it. That is why this trio works so well. They each represent a different response to fear. Charles is wounded hope, Eric is controlled rage, Mystique is pain looking for direction. And Days of Future Past understands that the fate of the world does not just depend on stopping machines. It depends on whether these three people can stop destroying each other long enough to choose a different future. Wolverine is in a strange position in Days of Future Past. He is technically the lead. He is the one sent back. He is the one who has to find Charles, break Magneto out, track Mystique, and somehow convince everyone that the future is already burning. So yes, the whole mission moves because of him, but emotionally, this is not really Wolverine's deepest character movie, and honestly, that works. By this point, Hugh Jackman has played Logan so many times that the film does not need to reintroduce him or explain why he matters. He walks into a scene and immediately brings that rough, tired, sarcastic presence with him. You believe him as the guy who has seen too much, survived too much, and is still somehow the only person stubborn enough to keep going. That makes him the perfect anchor for a story this complicated. The movie has two timelines, two casts, old grudges, future extinction, 1970s politics, and a lot of mutant history flying around. Wolverine gives the audience something familiar to hold on to. He is our way into the chaos. When the plot starts moving through time and continuity, Logan is the steady piece in the middle. But the smart thing is that the movie does not make him swallow everything around him. He could have easily dominated the film. The franchise has leaned on Wolverine before, sometimes too much. But here, even though he drives the plot, he leaves room for Charles, Eric, and Mystique to carry the emotional weight. He is not the one with the biggest internal transformation. He is the messenger, the warning signal. The guy from the nightmare future trying to shake the past awake, and there is something quietly interesting about that. Wolverine is usually the fighter, the clawed-up solution, the one you send into the room when subtlety has already died. But in this movie, his real job is not just to fight, it is to convince. He has to walk up to a broken Charles Xavier and say, basically, you don't know me, but I need you to become the man you're supposed to be. That is a different kind of pressure. Jackman plays that well. He still has the gruff humor, the physical presence, the little flashes of irritation that make Logan fun to watch. But there is also a more subdued quality here. He is not just angry. He is carrying the weight of a future no one else can see yet. So while Days of Future Past does not give Wolverine a massive personal arc, it uses him exactly where he is strongest. He connects the old cast to the new cast. He keeps the story moving. He gives the audience a familiar face in a very busy film. And maybe most importantly, he steps back just enough to let the real emotional damage happen around him. That is why his role works. He is not the heart of the movie this time. He is the spine. One of the boldest things Days of Future Past does is bring together two generations of X-Men, the old cast and the new cast, and somehow make it feel natural. This is tricky. Patrick Stewart, Ian McKellen, and Hugh Jackman have been around for over a decade in these roles. They carry a ton of history with them. Then you throw in James McAvoy, Michael Fassbender, Jennifer Lawrence, Nicholas Hoult, and a bunch of younger mutants from First Class, and you suddenly have a room full of people who all want screen time. The potential for chaos is huge, but Singer and the script manage it surprisingly well. The older cast mostly stays in the background, lending their weight without hogging the spotlight. Stewart and McKellen, as usual, are perfectly measured, bringing gravitas to scenes that could have felt overstuffed. Jackman bridges the gap, giving the new cast someone familiar to bounce off. Meanwhile, the younger cast gets room to grow. McAvoy's broken Charles Xavier, Fassbender's calculating young Magneto, and Lawrence's conflicted Mystique are the emotional anchors for the past timeline. They carry the tension and stakes of the story, while the older actors provide context, history, and perspective. The transition between the two eras feels deliberate, not forced. You don't get the sense that the old cast is there just for nostalgia, or that the young cast is a cheap replacement. They interact meaningfully. Their relationships, Charles and Eric, Logan and Charles, Mystique and both Xaviers, feel real and earned. Even smaller characters get their moments without derailing the story. Cameos from Storm, Iceman, and others are sprinkled in strategically. Some characters could have been given more. Sure, Rogue barely shows up, and some of the future mutants feel like fan service, but the balance mostly works. It's the kind of ensemble juggling that could easily have fallen apart, but instead, it gives the film energy. You get a sense of the franchise's legacy, the continuity of its characters, and the passing of the torch from one generation to the next. In short, the film doesn't just merge old and new for fun. It uses both casts to reinforce the story and the stakes. And that, honestly, is one of the most impressive feats of Days of Future Past. The cast in Days of Future Past is almost unfair. This movie has so many recognizable faces that it could have easily turned into one of those films where everyone shows up, says two serious lines, uses a power, and disappears. And to be fair, a few characters do get that treatment, but the main performers, they really hold this thing together. Hugh Jackman is still completely at home as Wolverine. At this point, he doesn't have to prove anything in the role. He has the growl, the dry humor, the tired eyes, the physical presence, all of it feels built into him. What works here is that he is not overplaying Logan. He is rough, sure, but there's also this worn-down quality to him, like he has carried too many bad futures on his shoulders. He gives the movie its familiar pulse. James McAvoy might be the standout emotionally, though. His Charles Xavier is in a messy, painful place, and McAvoy doesn't make it pretty. He plays Charles like someone who has lost faith and hates himself a little for it. There are scenes where you can feel the future Professor X buried somewhere underneath all that anger and grief, and that's what makes his arc work. He isn't just doing an imitation of Patrick Stewart. He is showing us the man before he earns that calm wisdom. Michael Fassbender, on the other hand, gives Magneto that sharp, dangerous elegance. He doesn't need to shout to feel threatening. Half the time, the danger is in how still he is. You can see why people would follow him, and you can also see why trusting him is a terrible idea. That's the perfect Magneto balance. Jennifer Lawrence has a tricky job as Mystique because the whole future basically turns on her choices. If that performance doesn't work, the movie loses a lot of its weight, and she does make it work. Her Raven feels angry, isolated, and determined, but not empty. She isn't just there to be chased around the plot. You understand why she is making these choices, even when the choices are dangerous. Then you have the veterans. Patrick Stewart brings that calm authority the second he appears. He doesn't need much screen time to remind you why his version of Xavier matters. Ian McKellen does the same with Magneto. There's history in his face, regret in his voice, and still that little edge of menace underneath everything. These two actors carry so much franchise memory with them that even their quieter scenes feel heavier. Peter Dinklage is also a strong addition as Bolivar Trask. He plays him with control, not cartoon villain energy, which was the right choice. Trask feels like someone who believes he is being practical, maybe even necessary, and that makes him more interesting than if he were just sneering in a lab coat. Nicholas Hoult is solid as Beast, bringing a bit of warmth and conflict to the younger team. Halle Berry's Storm is more limited than you might expect, but this is probably one of her better uses in the series. Ellen Page gives Kitty Pryde real importance in the future timeline, even if the movie uses her more as a story mechanism than a full character. Fan Bingbing's Blink is visually memorable, mostly because her powers make the future battles feel much more dynamic. And then, of course, Evan Peters comes in as Quicksilver and casually walks away with one of the most talked-about scenes in the entire movie. That's the funny thing about this cast. Some of them get full arcs, some get small moments. Some are basically there to remind longtime fans, yes, this world is still connected. But because the actors are strong across the board, even the smaller appearances usually land. The film doesn't give everyone equal attention, and honestly, it couldn't. There are just too many people here, but the key performances are strong enough to make the emotional story feel grounded. McAvoy, Fassbender, Lawrence, and Jackman carry the main weight, while Stewart, McKellen, and the returning cast give it that sense of history. It's a big ensemble, maybe too big in places, but when it works, it really works. All right, let's talk about Quicksilver, because if there's one moment in Days of Future Past that makes you want to rewind and watch it again immediately, it's him. Evan Peters, in a surprisingly small role, absolutely steals the show. And it's not just because of his powers. Sure, the super speed stuff is incredible, visually inventive, fun, and unlike anything else in the movie. But it's also about timing, humor, and attitude. Quicksilver brings a spark into what could have been an otherwise heavy, tense film. The highlight, of course, is the Pentagon scene. The camera slows down, bullets hang in the air, and he casually rearranges everything in the room so that the security guard's fire misses the X-Men entirely. It's ridiculous, it's playful, and it's completely satisfying to watch. You're laughing, you're impressed, and yet it never feels out of place. It serves the story while giving the audience a little moment of joy amidst all the doom and gloom. It's the perfect example of comic book spectacle done right. Instead of flashy moves for no reason, his scene has stakes. The X-Men need to survive, the future depends on it, and Quicksilver is the key. Every move is clever, but it's also fun to watch, and it somehow manages to give the movie some breathing room without undercutting the tension elsewhere. And honestly, Peter's performance is just pure charisma. He doesn't try to dominate the film, he's not the lead, but he makes sure we remember him. A few lines, a few expressions, and a single jaw-dropping sequence, and suddenly Quicksilver becomes one of the most memorable things in the movie. It's a reminder that sometimes a small role, done with confidence, style, and a bit of cheek, can overshadow much larger storylines. Quicksilver isn't just a scene stealer. He's a moment that makes the movie feel alive in a way that's playful, inventive, and utterly unforgettable. Mystique's role in Days of Future Past is interesting because she is not just part of the story this time. She basically is the turning point of the story. Everything depends on what Raven decides to do. If she kills Trask, the future collapses into the Sentinel nightmare. If she walks away, history has a chance to move differently. That puts a lot of pressure on one character, and honestly, it is a pretty bold choice, because Mystique was not always treated as this central emotional force in the earlier films. Here, though, the movie makes her matter in a much bigger way. She is not simply a cool blue assassin sneaking through government buildings. She is angry, hurt, and convinced that she is doing what needs to be done, and that makes her more compelling. You may not agree with her plan, but you understand where it comes from. She has seen what humans are willing to do to mutants. She has seen experimentation, fear, control, and cruelty. So when she decides that Trask deserves to die, it does not feel random. It feels like pain turning into action. The tricky part is that some viewers may wonder why Mystique became this important to the franchise all of a sudden. And yeah, I get that. If you are thinking back to the earlier films, it can feel a little strange that the entire future of mutant kind suddenly revolves around her choice. But Jennifer Lawrence helps sell it. She gives Raven enough emotion that the plot does not feel completely mechanical. Mystique is not just a device the movie uses to trigger the Sentinels. She feels like someone standing at a dangerous crossroads. Revenge is right there. Power is right there, and walking away from it would not be weakness, it would be the harder choice. That is what gives her role weight. The movie is not only asking whether Mystique can be stopped. It is asking whether she can still choose who she wants to become before the world turns her into a symbol. Because once she pulls that trigger, her pain no longer belongs only to her. It becomes history. It becomes propaganda. It becomes the excuse for a war that destroys everyone. And that is why her expanded importance works better than it probably should. Even if you question how central she has become, her emotional position in the story is strong. Raven is caught between Charles' hope and Eric's violence, between being hunted and becoming the reason others are hunted. For a movie about changing the future, Mystique is the character standing closest to the moment where everything breaks. Magneto is one of those characters who can walk into a scene and immediately change the temperature. And in Days of Future Past, that presence is still there. Michael Fassbender plays the younger Eric with this cold, controlled confidence that makes him fascinating to watch, even when he is making the worst possible decision. He does not need to scream. He does not need to over-explain himself. Half the danger comes from how calm he is. You can see the calculation happening behind his eyes, and that is what makes him so unnerving. The thing with Magneto is that he is rarely just the villain. That is too simple. He is dangerous because he has a point, or at least enough of a point to make people listen. He understands fear. He understands persecution. He understands what happens when powerful people decide mutants are a problem to be solved. But then he takes that pain and turns it into domination. That is where Eric becomes terrifying. In this movie, every time the mission looks like it might hold together, Magneto finds a way to complicate it. He does not really trust teamwork. He does not fully trust Charles. He definitely does not believe in waiting around for humans to do the right thing. So even when he is technically helping, there is always this feeling that he has another plan forming in his head. And visually, the movie knows exactly how to use him. Whenever Magneto uses his powers, the film gives the moment weight. It is not just metal flying around for the sake of a cool shot. There is scale to it, force, intimidation. The stadium sequence is the obvious big one. It is pure Magneto theater. He does not just move something massive because he can. He turns it into a statement. He reshapes the environment around him like he is announcing to the world, this is what power looks like. That is why Magneto's scenes land so well. He is not just powerful. He believes his power gives him clarity. And that is the dangerous part. Eric is so convinced that fear must be answered with greater fear that he becomes almost impossible to reason with. Even when you understand his anger, you can see how quickly it leads him somewhere frightening. Fassbender captures that balance beautifully. There is elegance in his Magneto, but also cruelty. There is dignity, but also arrogance. He can seem wounded one second and completely ruthless the next. And that is what makes him such a strong presence in Days of Future Past. He is not always on screen. But whenever he is, the movie feels less stable, in the best possible way. Charles Xavier's arc is probably the strongest emotional thread in Days of Future Past. And what makes it work is that the movie doesn't introduce him as the Professor X we expect. When Wolverine finds him in 1973, Charles is not calm, wise, patient, or full of hope. He is a mess. He is drinking, hiding away from the world, and using a serum that lets him walk but cuts him off from his powers. That detail is important because it is not just a physical trade. It says something about where he is emotionally. Charles would rather numb a part of himself than feel everything he has lost. That is a dark place for this character. We are used to seeing Xavier as the dreamer, the man who believes people can be better, the man who looks at fear and still chooses compassion. But here, that man is buried. James McAvoy plays him like someone who has been disappointed so deeply that hope now feels almost insulting. There is anger in him, but also shame. He knows he has fallen apart, and he hates being reminded of what he was supposed to become. That is why Wolverine's arrival hits him so hard. Logan is not just asking Charles to help with a mission. He is asking him to become himself again, and that is much harder than stopping a bullet or breaking someone out of prison. Charles has to face the fact that he walked away. From his students, from his dream, from his gift, from the responsibility that comes with being who he is. The scene between young Charles and older Xavier is where the arc really lands. It could have felt like a gimmick, two versions of the same character sharing a big emotional moment, but it doesn't. It feels quiet, painful, and strangely comforting. Older Xavier is not there to lecture him like a perfect saint. He is there as proof that Charles can survive this moment, that the pain he feels now does not have to be the end of him, and McAvoy is excellent in those scenes. He lets Charles be ugly in his sadness. Not evil, not cruel exactly, but wounded in a way that makes him selfish and lost. Then slowly, you see the old beliefs start to come back, not all at once, not in some clean heroic switch. More like a man remembering how to stand up emotionally before he fully becomes the leader everyone needs. That is what makes his journey satisfying. Charles does not save the future by becoming powerful again in the usual superhero sense. He saves it by choosing hope when hopelessness would be easier. He chooses to reach Mystique instead of control her. He chooses to believe that one person can still change direction before history locks into place. For a movie packed with robots, timelines, and giant set pieces, Charles Xavier's arc gives it something human. It reminds you that sometimes the biggest battle in an X-Men film is not against the machine outside. It is against the despair inside the person who is supposed to lead everyone else. The Sentinels are probably the most effective threat in Days of Future Past because the movie doesn't treat them like ordinary robot enemies. They are not just there to give the X-Men something big to fight. From the opening scenes, the Sentinels feel like a nightmare that has already won. They don't hesitate. They don't get tired. They don't care who the mutants are, how powerful they are, or how hard they fight back. They just adapt, attack, and erase them. That's what makes them scary. Not personality, not speeches, not villain monologues, just cold, mechanical certainty. And honestly, that works really well. A lot of superhero movies struggle when the villain is basically an army of machines. It can become boring fast, just waves of CGI bodies being smashed around until the movie decides it's over. But here, the Sentinels have weight because the film shows us what they mean. These machines are the reason the future is dead. They are the reason the remaining mutants are hiding. They are the reason even characters as powerful as Storm, Magneto, Iceman, and the others feel like survivors instead of heroes in control. The future battles sell that beautifully. Every time the Sentinels appear, there is this ugly sense that the mutants are only delaying the inevitable. They can fight smart. They can combine powers. They can throw everything they have at them. But the Sentinels keep adjusting, keep pushing, keep closing in. That makes them more than just physical villains. They are a symbol. They represent fear turned into technology, human prejudice given metal skin. The idea that if society becomes afraid enough of people who are different, it will eventually build systems to control them, classify them, and destroy them. That is why they fit so well in an X-Men story. The Sentinels are not just big robots. They are the logical endpoint of everything the franchise has been warning about from the beginning, and that is what makes Trask's creation so disturbing. He doesn't just build weapons. He builds a future where fear becomes automated, where persecution no longer needs emotion behind it. It becomes a program, a mission, a machine that never questions itself. That's chilling. The Sentinels also give the time travel plot real urgency. If Wolverine fails, this is what everyone is heading toward, not just a bad future, not just a darker timeline, extinction. The movie makes that clear without needing to explain it every 5 minutes. You see the Sentinels in action, and you understand immediately why the past has to change. So while they may not be characters in the traditional sense, they are still powerful villains, maybe even more powerful because of how impersonal they are. They don't hate mutants. They don't need to. They were built by people who did. Visually, Days of Future Past has a really strong sense of contrast. The future scenes look cold, ruined, and almost drained of life. Everything feels broken down, the cities, the atmosphere, even the people. There is this heavy, metallic darkness to those sequences that immediately tells you the world has already lost. The movie doesn't need to over-explain how bad things have become. You can see it in the empty spaces, the destroyed environments, and the way the surviving mutants move like they're always one step away from being wiped out. Then the film jumps back to the 1970s, and suddenly the texture changes. The past has more warmth, more color, more physical detail. The clothes, the rooms, the political spaces, the little period touches, it all gives that timeline its own identity. It doesn't feel like the same world with a different date stamped on it. It feels like history before the damage fully sets in. Not innocent, exactly, but still alive. That visual separation helps the storytelling more than people might notice, because with a film jumping between two timelines, you need the audience to feel the difference instantly. The future is where everything has collapsed. The past is where everything is still unstable, still dangerous, but not yet doomed. The cinematography supports that without making it too obvious or showy. The film also has a slickness to it that fits the scale of the story. It looks polished, expensive, and controlled. The action scenes have weight, the quieter scenes have atmosphere, and the bigger images, especially the ruined future and Magneto's large-scale power moments, have that comic book grandeur without becoming completely cartoonish. And I like that the movie doesn't look flat. A lot of modern superhero films can start to blur together visually, especially when everything becomes CGI smoke, rubble, and glowing energy. Days of Future Past does have plenty of digital spectacle, no doubt, but the best-looking moments still feel tied to mood. The future looks oppressive because it is oppressive. The 1970s setting feels slightly strange and tense because the story is playing with history, politics, and paranoia. It is not just cool visuals for the sake of cool visuals. The images are helping tell the story. That's why the visual style works. It gives the film scale, but also atmosphere. It lets the future feel like a nightmare and the past feel like a fragile chance to avoid it. And for a movie built around changing history, that contrast matters. The production design in Days of Future Past does a lot of quiet heavy lifting, and I mean that in a good way. Because this movie is constantly moving between two very different worlds, the ruined future and the 1970s past. If those two timelines didn't feel visually distinct, the whole thing could have become muddy very quickly. But the film gives each era its own texture, its own mood, almost its own smell, if that makes sense. The future is stripped down and grim. Everything feels hard, cold, and metallic. The spaces are dark, damaged, and practical, like the characters are no longer living in the world so much as hiding in whatever corners are left. There's no comfort there, no softness, just survival. Then we jump back to the 1970s, and the movie suddenly gets more personality. The costumes, the hair, the rooms, the decor, the political spaces, all of it feels carefully chosen without becoming a parody of the decade. You get the period flavor, yes, but the film doesn't stop dead just to say, look, it's the 70s. It's more casual than that. A lava lamp here, a suit cut there, a certain color palette in the background, and suddenly the whole timeline has a different energy. That's the kind of design work I appreciate. It supports the story without shouting over it. The makeup is also a big part of why the world works. Mystique's look still has that striking screen presence. The blue skin, the texture, the transformations, it's familiar by this point, but still effective. And Beast's design feels improved too. His transitions have more polish, and Nicholas Holt's version of the character feels more naturally integrated into the movie than he easily could have. Costume-wise, the film has a tricky job because it's dealing with superhero characters, period clothing, and future war survival gear all at once. That could easily look ridiculous, but most of it lands. The future costumes feel functional and battle-worn. The 1970s clothes give the past timeline some character, and the returning older cast has enough visual familiarity that you immediately understand the history they carry. Even the art direction helps sell the scale. The government locations, the prison setup, the ruined future hideouts, the political interiors, they all give the movie a sense of place. It doesn't feel like the actors are just standing in front of expensive backdrops. The environments feel connected to the tension of the story. That's what makes the design impressive. It isn't just about making things look cool, although plenty of it does look cool. It's about making the timelines feel different, making the characters feel rooted in their worlds, and giving the whole film a polished, lived-in quality. For a movie with this much plot machinery, those details matter. They make the past feel alive, they make the future feel dead, and somewhere between those two visual worlds, the movie finds its stakes. The special effects in Days of Future Past are just wow. I mean, this is a film where CGI could have easily overwhelmed everything. Giant sentinels, massive city destruction, mutant powers flying in every direction. It's the kind of thing that can turn into a digital mess really fast. But here, the effects are not just eye candy. They actually serve the story. Take the Sentinels, for example. They are enormous, intimidating, and perfectly terrifying, but they don't just exist to look cool. Every move they make raises the stakes for the characters. You feel the threat because the film makes it clear these things are relentless, adaptive, and lethal. And that's what makes the chaos in the future timeline so gripping. Then there's Quicksilver. That sequence in the Pentagon, slow motion, bullets frozen midair, objects rearranged with insane precision, is one of the most inventive uses of CGI I've seen in a superhero film. It's playful, it's clever, and yet it's fully integrated into the story. You're laughing, you're impressed, and it actually matters. That's a rare thing in a movie that relies so heavily on visual effects. The destruction sequences in the future timeline are also beautifully done. Cities crumbling, buildings destroyed, mutant hideouts obliterated. It feels grounded despite being huge and fantastical. You believe that the stakes are real. Every explosion, every collapsing structure, every lightning-charged attack from Magneto carries weight. Even subtle effects, the portals, the psychic powers, the beast transformations, are polished without calling too much attention to themselves. The visual language of the movie is consistent, which keeps the audience immersed instead of distracted. And the best part, the effects never take over the characters. They enhance the story instead of replacing it. You still care about Charles, Eric, Mystique, and Wolverine because their actions drive the CGI, not the other way around. So yeah, the CGI is flashy, it's huge, it's impressive, but it's also smart. It gives the movie scale, danger, and spectacle without ever feeling empty. And when you combine that with the character drama, the time travel stakes, and the future/past contrast, it really makes Days of Future Past feel like the blockbuster it was always meant to be. The action in Days of Future Past works because it doesn't all feel like the same kind of noise. That's a small thing, but it matters. A lot of superhero movies hit a point where every fight starts to blur together. Energy blasts, bodies flying through walls, buildings breaking apart, someone yelling over the music, you know the routine. But here, the major set pieces each have their own flavor. They're not just bigger versions of the same scene. The opening future battle is probably the harshest one. It throws us straight into survival mode. The X-Men are not dominating the Sentinels. They are scrambling, combining powers, buying seconds, trying to survive something that feels almost impossible to beat. That gives the scene a real sense of panic. It's not heroic in the usual clean way. It's desperate. Then you get the 1970s prison escape, and the whole movie suddenly shifts gears. That sequence is lighter, sharper, and more playful, mainly because of Quicksilver. It's not about brute force. It's about timing, style, and a weird little burst of fun in the middle of a very serious story. The slow-motion room sequence could have been a gimmick, but it's staged so well that it becomes one of the film's defining moments. It's clever action, not just loud action. Magneto's set pieces are different again. Whenever he uses his powers, the film leans into scale. He doesn't just fight people, he rearranges the world around him. The stadium sequence is the obvious example, and it's exactly the kind of comic book image that could look ridiculous if the movie didn't commit to it. But it does. Magneto turns a massive public space into a weapon, a prison, and a statement all at once. It's dramatic, slightly insane, and very much in character. The future Sentinel attacks bring back that feeling of dread. Every time those machines appear, the action becomes tense because the movie has already shown us how dangerous they are. The mutants can fight beautifully as a team, and the combination of powers is exciting to watch, but there's always that ugly feeling that they're only delaying the inevitable. And that's what gives these set pieces weight. They're not just inserted to wake the audience up. Each one pushes the story or reveals something about the characters. Quicksilver's scene gives the film humor and invention. Magneto's scenes show his terrifying confidence. The future battles remind us what failure looks like. Even the climactic action is tied to the question of whether the past can still be changed before everything collapses. Not every moment is perfect. Some of the CGI-heavy fighting does get a little busy, and depending on your taste, the final stretch may feel more chaotic than elegant. But overall, the action is strong because it has rhythm. It knows when to go brutal, when to go stylish, when to go playful, and when to go huge. That variety keeps the movie alive. Days of Future Past gives you spectacle, definitely, but the best set pieces don't feel empty. They feel connected to fear, desperation, ego, survival, and choice. And that's why the action lands harder than just another round of mutants smashing robots. Days of Future Past is not a gentle movie. And honestly, it shouldn't be. From the very start, you realize this isn't about cartoonish superhero violence. The Sentinels are terrifying, and the attacks on mutants are brutal. There are moments that push the limits of a PG-13 rating, limbs flying, people getting torn apart, and a real sense that failure here is catastrophic. It's violent in a way that feels earned, not just there for shock value. You feel the danger, and it isn't abstract. The mutants can die, humans can die, stakes are real, and the film lets you see it. What's interesting is that even with all that intensity, the movie doesn't lean into gore for its own sake. It's a superhero film, not a horror movie. You get the impact, the tension, the fear, but it's still stylized enough that it's thrilling rather than disgusting. You walk away feeling the weight of what's at risk, but not traumatized for the wrong reasons. There are a few scenes where the intensity is almost overwhelming. The future sequences, especially, are harsh. You see mutants and humans alike falling to the Sentinels' relentless assault. It's fast, violent, and relentless. Yet the film tempers that with moments of calm, a quick joke, a character interaction, or a slow-motion sequence like Quicksilver's Pentagon scene, giving your brain a breather without undercutting the danger. Even Wolverine's fights, which could have been non-stop slaughter, are mostly about efficiency. He's brutal when he needs to be, but he's not there to get a cheap laugh from how violent it looks. The consequences matter. The intensity serves the story, the characters, and the stakes. So yes, this is a PG-13 superhero movie that doesn't shy away from showing that the future is terrifying. It respects its rating, but it doesn't shy away from making you feel how high the stakes are. You can sense the tension in every fight, every Sentinel attack, every moral choice, and it gives the movie a pulse that a lot of comic book films don't have. It's violent, yes, sometimes a little shocking for a PG-13, but it's the kind of violence that makes the story feel real, urgent, and worth caring about. One of the things I noticed right away about Days of Future Past is how it manages its pacing. At 131 minutes, you might expect a film juggling two timelines, a huge ensemble cast, and time travel mechanics to feel bloated. And honestly, it could have been a complete mess, but surprisingly, it rarely drags. The movie opens with the future timeline, and it hits hard, tense, grim, and desperate. You're immediately thrown into the stakes without feeling lost, and that urgency carries through the first hour. Then, when the story shifts to 1973, it slows just enough to let the drama breathe. You get character moments, dialogue that matters, and a chance to understand the emotional weight behind the mission. Even with so many characters and plot threads, the film moves along at a smart rhythm. The story doesn't linger unnecessarily, and the transitions between past and future rarely feel jarring. Each beat serves a purpose: a fight scene, a conversation, a quiet moment of reflection. It keeps the momentum going without feeling exhausting. The cleverness is that the movie mixes intensity and downtime organically. Quicksilver's Pentagon sequence is playful and allows the audience to exhale for a moment before plunging back into the chaos. Emotional confrontations between Charles, Eric, and Mystique are paced so they hit harder, because the movie isn't just rushing to the next explosion. Sure, the second hour has a few slower stretches, especially when juggling multiple plot threads at once. And yes, if you start overthinking the timelines, you might feel a little tangled, but for the most part, it's remarkably controlled. You never feel like the film is dragging, and the runtime actually works in its favor, giving characters and action room to coexist without suffocating each other. By the time the climax hits, the movie has earned it. The pacing has built tension, character stakes, and suspense so that the final battles feel consequential, not just flashy set pieces. In short, Days of Future Past knows when to push forward, when to slow down, and how to keep the audience engaged across two very different timelines. For a film this ambitious, that's no small feat. The fan service in Days of Future Past is kind of a mixed bag, but mostly in a good way. Because let's be honest, part of the fun of this movie is seeing so many familiar faces come back. Patrick Stewart, Ian McKellen, Halle Berry, Ellen Page, Shawn Ashmore, Daniel Cudmore. The film knows there is history attached to these people. It knows that longtime viewers are going to feel something just from seeing the original X-Men cast together again, especially after the franchise had gone in so many different directions. And for the most part, it uses that nostalgia well. The future timeline almost feels like a last gathering. These characters are older, tired, and living in a world that has already punished them. Storm, Iceman, Colossus, Kitty Pryde, they may not all get huge emotional arcs, but their presence gives the future scenes weight. You're not just watching random mutants fight robots. You're watching characters who have been part of this series for years trying to survive the end of everything. That matters. But at the same time, some of the cameos are definitely thin. A few characters show up mostly to use their powers, remind fans they exist, and then move out of the way. And depending on who your favorites are, that can be a little frustrating. Rogue, especially, feels almost painfully underused. Considering how important she was at the start of the franchise, seeing her reduced to such a tiny appearance is disappointing. It's nice that she's there, sure, but it also makes you wish the film had found a better place for her. That's the downside of having this many characters. Someone is always going to get squeezed. The movie has to prioritize the main story, and the main story belongs more to Wolverine, Charles, Eric, and Mystique than to the returning future cast. So while the cameos can be exciting, they sometimes feel more like emotional decoration than full character material. Still, I don't think the fan service feels empty. There's a difference between throwing characters on screen just for applause and using them to remind the audience of the world that's at stake. Days of Future Past usually falls into the second category. The returning characters give the future a sense of legacy. They make the danger feel personal because we've seen some of these people across multiple films, and when the movie does let them fight, it's satisfying. Seeing Storm, Iceman, Colossus, Kitty, and the others using their powers together gives the future battles a real team feeling. It's not always deep, but it is exciting. It scratches that fan itch without completely derailing the movie. So yes, some characters deserved more. Rogue deserved more. A few others probably did too, but as a piece of franchise fan service, Days of Future Past understands the assignment. It brings back the old faces, gives them a sense of dignity, and uses them to make the film feel like a true meeting point between the past and future of the X-Men series. One thing I can't really ignore about Days of Future Past is that this movie is packed. Like seriously packed. There are mutants everywhere. Old mutants, young mutants, future mutants, returning mutants, new mutants, characters from First Class, characters from the original trilogy, characters who show up for 2 seconds, characters who use one cool power and then basically vanish. For fans, that can be exciting. It gives the movie that big event feeling, like the franchise is bringing everyone it can into one massive turning point. But for casual viewers, yeah, I can see this getting confusing. If you haven't watched the earlier films recently, the movie does not always slow down to help you. It doesn't stop and explain every relationship, every power, every old conflict, or every timeline detail. It kind of assumes you already know the basics, and if you don't, you may find yourself sitting there thinking, wait, who is that? What can they do? Why does this matter? That's especially true in the future timeline. A lot of characters are introduced quickly, and some of them are treated more like power showcases than fully developed people. Blink opens portals, Bishop absorbs energy, Iceman does his thing, Colossus is there, Storm is there. Kitty has this very important ability driving the whole plot, but unless you already know these characters or remember them from earlier films, the movie doesn't give you much time to settle with them. And to be fair, I understand why. The film has a main story to tell, and that story is really about Wolverine, Charles, Eric, and Mystique. If the script stopped to give every mutant a full introduction, the pacing would collapse. So the movie chooses momentum over explanation. Most of the time, that works, but it does create a barrier for anyone walking in without much X-Men background. Even the timeline situation can be a little slippery. You have the future, the past, older Xavier, younger Xavier, older Magneto, younger Magneto, Wolverine's mind in his younger body, and a franchise history that already had some messy continuity before this movie even began. That's a lot. It's not impossible to follow, but it does ask the audience to keep up. So yes, Days of Future Past handles its crowded story better than it probably should, but crowded is still crowded. The film is strongest when it focuses on the emotional core. Charles losing hope, Eric choosing force, Mystique standing at the edge of revenge, Wolverine trying to hold the mission together. That stuff is clear and powerful. The extra characters are fun, sometimes very fun, but they can also make the movie feel a little busy around the edges. For longtime X-Men fans, that busyness may feel like a reward. For newcomers, it may feel like they arrived late to a conversation everyone else already understands. The technical side of Days of Future Past is one of those things you might not think about right away, because the movie is so busy with timelines, characters, and giant mutant-killing robots. But it matters a lot. The music, for example, gives the film a sense of weight without constantly begging for attention. John Ottman's score does what a good superhero score should do. It supports the scale, pushes the tension, and knows when to let the emotion come through. It is not just loud background noise under the action. It helps the future scenes feel desperate, the quieter moments feel reflective, and the big set pieces feel properly cinematic. And that's important because this movie has a lot of tonal shifts. One minute we are in a devastated future where mutants are being hunted. Then we are back in the 1970s with political tension, broken friendships, and Wolverine trying to convince everyone that the world is going to end. The music helps smooth those shifts. It gives the movie a consistent emotional pulse, even when the story is jumping between completely different timelines. The editing is also sharper than people may realize. A film like this could easily become clunky. Past, future, action, dialogue, exposition, character drama, back to future, back to past, there are so many moving parts. But the cutting usually keeps the story moving without making it feel rushed. We get enough time to sit with Charles' pain, enough time to understand Mystique's anger, enough time to feel the pressure building in the future timeline. And then when the action hits, the movie has rhythm. The Quicksilver sequence is the obvious editing showcase because the timing has to be perfect for that scene to work. It is funny, smooth, visually clear, and somehow relaxed in the middle of danger. But even outside that scene, the film generally knows how to move. It doesn't drown every fight in chaotic cuts. You can usually follow the powers, the geography, and the danger. That sounds basic, but in modern blockbuster filmmaking, it really isn't. The overall technical craft is strong across the board. The cinematography gives the two timelines different moods. The production design makes the 1970s feel alive and the future feel dead. The makeup and visual effects help the mutant world feel polished. The editing keeps the plot from turning into a lecture. And the score ties the emotional pieces together. Is every technical element flawless? No. Some CGI-heavy moments look very digital, and a few transitions in the story rely more on momentum than perfect logic. But as a complete package, the film feels professionally built, controlled, expensive, yes, but also carefully shaped. That's what separates it from a lot of overloaded superhero sequels. Days of Future Past has a huge amount of machinery under the hood, but most of the time you don't hear it grinding. The craft is doing its job quietly, keeping the movie stylish, tense, emotional, and easy to stay inside. And for a film this complicated, that is a serious achievement. What makes Days of Future Past stand out is that it doesn't really feel like it's chasing the same energy as every other superhero movie around it, and that's a good thing. A lot of comic book films, especially from that era, were leaning hard into speed, jokes, bright spectacle, and constant one-liners. You know the rhythm. Big action scene, sarcastic comment, another explosion, another joke, then a bigger action scene. And look, that style can absolutely work. When it's done well, it's fun. It gives the audience a good time. But Days of Future Past is playing a different game. This movie is darker, heavier, more serious about its world. It's not trying to be the loudest or the funniest superhero film in the room. It has humor, definitely, especially with Quicksilver, but the humor feels like a release valve rather than the whole personality of the movie. Most of the time, the film wants you to sit with the tension, and I respect that, because the X-Men have always had a slightly different flavor. Their stories are not just about saving the city from a villain. They're about fear, prejudice, survival, and whether people who are hated by society can still believe in coexistence. So when Days of Future Past takes itself seriously, it doesn't feel like the movie is trying too hard to be important. It feels like the material actually needs that weight. Compared to more colorful superhero blockbusters, this one feels more like a dramatic sci-fi thriller with comic book powers inside it. The stakes are not just, can the heroes win the battle? The question is bigger and sadder than that. Can they stop history from becoming a machine that destroys them? That gives the film a different kind of tension. Even the spectacle feels different. The action is huge, but it's not always celebratory. The future battles are harsh. The Sentinels are frightening. The destroyed world has a sense of finality to it. There's no victory lap feeling there. It's desperate. At the same time, the movie is not as grounded or stripped down as something like the darker Batman films. It still has portals, blue shapeshifters, metal bending, time travel, and giant robots. It is very much a superhero movie, but it tries to bring a little more thoughtfulness to the genre, a little more emotional consequence, and that balance is why it works. It has blockbuster scale, but it doesn't feel empty. It has fan service, but it's not only nostalgia. It has action, but it doesn't forget character. In a crowded superhero landscape, Days of Future Past manages to feel distinct because it leans into what makes X-Men different instead of trying to copy everyone else. It's not the funniest superhero movie. It's not the cleanest one either, but it has a seriousness, a sadness, and a sense of history that give it real identity. And that's why, even beside bigger and flashier comic book films, it still holds its own. For all the praise Days of Future Past deserves, it is not a flawless movie, and the biggest weakness is probably the same thing that makes it interesting: the time travel. The film moves fast enough that, while you're watching it, most of the logic problems don't completely ruin the experience. You're invested in the mission, the characters, the sentinels, the whole ticking clock feeling of it. But once you step back and start thinking about the timeline too carefully, yeah, some cracks show up. There are moments where the rules feel a little soft. Cause and effect do not always line up as neatly as they should. Certain choices feel designed more to create drama than because they make perfect sense. And the ending, depending on how generous you're feeling, is either emotionally satisfying or a little too convenient. That reset feeling is tricky. On one hand, it gives the franchise a cleaner future and softens the damage from earlier films. On the other hand, part of you can feel the movie quietly sweeping a few problems under the rug. It's clever, but it is still a bit of a cheat. A very entertaining cheat, but a cheat. The crowded cast is another issue. The movie has so many characters that some of them barely get room to breathe. For longtime fans, it is fun seeing familiar faces return, but not everyone gets treated equally. Some mutants are there mostly to show off a power, take part in a battle, or provide a quick nostalgia hit. Rogue's tiny appearance feels especially disappointing when you remember how important she once was to the series. Even Storm and some of the other returning characters feel more like emotional decoration than fully used characters. And if you're a casual viewer, that overcrowding can become confusing. The film assumes you know a lot already. It expects you to understand the older cast, the younger cast, the relationships, the previous films, and at least some of the franchise's messy continuity. If you haven't watched the earlier movies in a while, you might find yourself playing catch-up. Who is this? Why does that matter? Wait, which timeline are we in now? It is not impossible to follow, but it is definitely not the easiest entry point. There are also a few character decisions that feel questionable. Magneto, for example, is compelling as always, but some of his choices make the mission harder in ways that can feel slightly forced. The movie wants the tension of not knowing whether he can be trusted, and that works dramatically, but every now and then you can feel the script pushing him into conflict because the plot needs another complication. The second half is also a little less clean than the first. The first hour has such strong momentum. The future threat, Wolverine's arrival in the past, Broken Charles, the prison escape, Quicksilver's scene. It all moves beautifully. Later on, the film is still engaging, but the machinery becomes more visible. The plot starts bending a bit more. The climax is big and exciting, but not every piece of it feels completely airtight. And visually, while most of the effects are impressive, some CGI-heavy moments do look very digital. Not enough to wreck the film, but enough that certain future battles can feel a little artificial compared to the stronger character scenes. Still, none of these flaws sink the movie. That is the important thing. Days of Future Past has issues, but they are the kind of issues you can live with because the film is doing so much else right. It has ambition. It has strong performances. It has emotional weight. It has great set pieces. It understands the X-Men better than many of the franchise's weaker entries. So yes, the timeline is messy. Yes, some characters are underused. Yes, the ending is maybe too neat. But honestly, for a movie trying to merge two casts, repair a franchise, adapt a major comic storyline, and still function as a satisfying blockbuster, the fact that it works this well is kind of impressive. The flaws are there. They just don't erase the achievement. By the end of X-Men, Days of Future Past, what stands out most is how easily this movie could have gone wrong. Seriously, this had every reason to become a mess. Two timelines, two casts, time travel. Sentinels, franchise cleanup. Comic book expectations, returning characters, newer characters, old continuity problems, a whole emotional reset hiding inside a summer blockbuster. That is a dangerous amount of weight for one film to carry, and yet somehow it carries it. Not perfectly. Let's not pretend the timeline logic is flawless or every character gets the treatment they deserve. Some parts are too convenient, some cameos are too brief, and if you start pulling at the cause and effect threads, the whole thing can get a little wobbly. But as a movie experience, it works beautifully. It has scale, but it also has feeling. It has spectacle, but not empty spectacle. It has nostalgia, but it does not rely only on nostalgia. And most importantly, it remembers that the X-Men are at their best when the story is about more than powers. It is about fear, survival, identity, regret, and the painful possibility that people might still change before it is too late. That is why this film ranks so high in the franchise. For some fans, X-2O will always be the peak. And honestly, I understand that. X-2O has that clean, dark, confident superhero sequel energy that still holds up. For others, First Class might be the favorite because it gave the series a fresh pulse when it badly needed one. But Days of Future Past absolutely belongs in that same top-tier conversation. In some ways, it is the most ambitious X-Men film. Maybe not the cleanest, maybe not the simplest, but ambitious, definitely. It takes the old series and the new series and finds a way to make them speak to each other. It gives Hugh Jackman another strong Wolverine outing without letting him swallow the entire movie. It lets James McAvoy, Michael Fassbender, and Jennifer Lawrence carry the emotional core. It brings back Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen with real weight. It gives us one of the most memorable Quicksilver scenes in superhero cinema. And it makes the Sentinels feel like a genuine nightmare instead of just another CGI army. That is a lot. And the fact that the movie also functions as a course correction for the franchise makes it even more impressive. It bends time, cleans up damage, and gives the X-Men films a future again. You can call that clever. You can call it convenient. Honestly, it is probably both, but it is satisfying. That is the word I keep coming back to. Satisfying. It feels like a movie made by people who understood the pressure. They knew fans wanted the old cast respected. They knew the younger cast needed room to grow. They knew the series had baggage. They knew the story had to feel big but also personal, and for the most part they found the balance. So no, Days of Future Past is not flawless, but it is exciting, emotional, stylish, and surprisingly thoughtful for a blockbuster this crowded. It is one of the rare franchise movies that does repair work and still feels like a real story, not just maintenance. For me, it stands as one of the best X-Men films, maybe the best, depending on the day. And even if you do not put it at number one, it is hard to deny what it achieved. It took a broken timeline, a divided franchise, and years of uneven storytelling, and turned all of that into one of the most entertaining and rewarding superhero sequels of its era.